Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video we're going to talk about techniques for accurate aiming if your pistol optic fails. This is a topic I've covered kind of piecemeal in other videos when I was talking about MRDS on handguns. So I wanted to do a video where it kind of collects the techniques into one video and updates it a little bit, refreshes it a little bit, because some of the videos are kind of old. And I know not everybody digs deep into the channel, check things out. And this is something I cover in classes. I have a class specific for red dot handguns because they're becoming more and prevalent, more and more popular, and you're starting to see them be adopted. It's not widespread yet, but it's definitely getting there because it is the future, and the future is almost now. But getting widespread adoption in law enforcement, and that'll trickle into more of your everyday carry, and I imagine even the military at some point is going to start to look at these. But because it's an electronic device, it can fail. Now, of course, iron sights can fail too. In many situations, if your gun was to be dropped, the impact it would take to break a high-quality optic would also be good enough to shear off or break off your front sight or possibly damage your rear sight. But I don't think anybody would argue the point that the likelihood of an optic breaking in a fall is slightly greater, depending on the brand of the optic, than it would be for iron sights. Aside from breakage, we also have some concerns from weather and, of course, the environment itself in which the firearm is being used. So just a simplification of terms for the video. We've got the objective lens, the optic lens, and then inside of the almost all MRDS is going to be the emitter, some variation thereof. I use Trijicon RMR because consistently they have been the most rugged, it's in the name, most durable and most reliable optic for my use. There are some other optics out there that give you some different benefits. I wouldn't say necessarily better because it does get into a degree of preference. But the RMR is what I use, so that's what I'm going to focus on in this video, but I will address the other optic types out there because the one thing that definitely sets the RMR apart for the purposes of the techniques we're going to talk about is the actual shape of the RMR body. We also need to cover what constitutes a failure of the optic. What I'm talking about in this video is either the optic fails, as in it dies, the dot is no longer being projected into the window to where you can use it as a red dot sight, or something is obscuring either the objective or the ocular lens to where you cannot accurately see through it, which is how you use the optic itself. We'll look at the three most common types. The first one is going to be the optic just dies. Nothing else is causing a problem, the optic just dies. This is the easiest one. This is why we keep iron sights on our handgun. If the optic stops working for some reason, and this was somewhat more possible in the past with the Type 1 RMR because connectivity issues, you just go to your iron sights. You haven't forgotten how to use them. You should still be practicing on them. You should still stay proficient on them. I can't think of any reason with a good high quality, even with a good high quality optic, to ever take the iron sights off the gun because they're not in the way. Well, they kind of are, but they're not so obtrusive. They're not so distracting that they're going to create a problem or keep you from being able to use the red dot when the red dot is working, which is going to be most of the time if you buy a high quality optic. But if this thing just, guys, there's really no technique there that I need to cover. You just go back to iron sights. And it's a simple transition. If I press out and I know my presentation is on point, or during the string of fire my dot just fails me, it should be an easy mental switch. Okay, dots down, go back to iron sights. I haven't forgotten how to use them. They're there. I keep them on the gun for a reason. Next up, one I've covered in a video before, but I'm going to cover it again here just so it's all in one place, is my objective lens. If something obscures my objective lens to a degree to where I can't see through it. Now this could be environmental like fog, condensation, or it could be mud, snow, something like that. Something with a high degree of stubbornness, if you will. If it's fog, temperature regulation, or just a little wipe if you have time, no big deal. But if it's mud or something like that, even during recoil, it may still obscure the lens, or it can leave a film on there to where I can't PID my target through my optic. If this occurs, what we're going to use is occluded eye shooting. Basically, if you're familiar with the history of red dot sights in general, some of the first, arguably the first electronic red dot sights out there, like the Armisen AEG, utilized our occluded eye shooting. And I still see shooters today that take their aim point or whatever optic they're using and they keep that objective lens closed. And what they get, just like the way the Armisen worked, is a dot is projected onto a black background inside the tube, inside the optic body. And the brain combines the two images. You're probably familiar with this concept if you've ever used an ACOG. It's a very similar technique, like by naming concept. Basically what it is I'm allowing my brain to take the image from my dominant eye or my aiming eye and combine it with the unobscured eye or the unoccluded eye or the unblocked eye, and combine those two images in my brain to allow me to shoot accurately. This doesn't affect your ability to shoot at distance. It doesn't affect your ability to shoot at speed. It does take some getting used to, especially if you have an extreme eye dominance problem. Another interesting quirk that comes up, especially with handguns that I see, is some people are already collecting a generous amount of data from their non-dominant eye, and all their dominant eye literally does is align the gun with the face. So when I have students in class and we occlude that objective lens, we block it with painter's tape or something like that, and they'll press out, they don't see the dot. And they have to physically move the gun in a position that they're like, well, I've been shooting dominant eye, I don't understand why I'm not getting my data. What it is their support side eye, if you will, or their non-dominant eye is actually the one controlling the position of the gun. And now that we're controlling or changing the data that's being fed to the dominant eye, it does create some alignment issues with them. So if you are going to carry a red dot sight, this is something that you definitely need to practice, not only so you know how to do it, but you also see what kind of physiological concerns it's going to create with your ability to shoot. The technique is really simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to obscure the optic with something for my practice purposes. I use painter's tape just because it comes off, it doesn't leave a film, it's really easy, on and off, no big deal. I'm going to cover that outside lens. This is the same as if the objective lens was obscured with mud or something like that. I'm still going to have that red dot. It's just not going to be, the optic isn't going to be, I can't see through it. So I can combine that blocked image with the red dot projected onto whatever's blocking my optic itself with the data that's coming from my non-dominant eye, and I can align my dot with my desired point of aim, and I can shoot and shoot accurately. Even as distance increases, this is not the end of the world. It's not a big deal. You can still be able to deliver accurate gunfire. The greater distance I have, of course, this is very situational. We don't want to go too far into predicting specific scenarios when we talk about techniques, because we want them to be as modular and useful as possible. But if I have the available time to clear my objective lens, that's obviously what I'm going to do. The more complicated technique, the one that deserves very due attention, is what happens if the emitter or the ocular lens is obstructed. Maybe something gets inside there, mud, dirt. For people who live in very humid environments, this is definitely a possibility depending on how your gun is carried. The emitter fogs. If the emitter fogs, it can completely block or significantly obscure your dot's projection onto that ocular lens. The ocular lens is going to fog as well. If your emitter fogs, I would imagine the entire optic body fogs itself. Now, if the stars align in a horrible way and it forces you to use the firearm before it becomes temperature neutral and that condensation, that fogging goes away, how do I aim the gun? Well, with the RMR, I'm going to use the basic design of the RMR body itself. I've got these owl ears. Now, this isn't going to be precision shooting. When I say precision, I mean being able to deliver accurate gunfire to a point on a target versus delivering accurate gunfire to a critical region of the target. So for me, just for disambiguation, practical accuracy in the human body is brainstem, heart. We'll just use that definition. Precision accuracy would be cranial vault, or I should say practical accuracy would be either cranial vault or just the high thoracic cavity. I want to deliver consistent rounds to those areas. So aiming in the method I'm going to talk about gives me that practical accuracy at reasonable handgun distances. First, how does it work? Well, my target alignment, my handgun alignment to my target, my threat, is going to be made the way it's always made, generally speaking. Eye-hand coordination. It's going to bring the handgun into a reasonable point of aim on the target to where I can't be practical or precise, but I am pointing the gun at the target. If I were to pull the trigger, I'm more than likely going to get a hit or be very, very close. Of course, it doesn't end there, but that's the first step. That kinesthetic, that natural eye-hand coordination is a huge part of shooting that sometimes we forget about. And it's definitely a bigger part of shooting with a handgun, because we only have these 2 points of contact, or maybe even one, than it is with a rifle, where I've got a cheek weld, shoulder, two hands, primary and support hand. The second method is going to be what I call bracketing. I'm going to use the owl ears, if you will, of the RMR body in relation to the target that's presented to me. Now, on this target, I'm using ideal presentation squared threat. And this is something you can practice on three-dimensional targets. You can get an idea what it'd be like if the target was completely flank or oblique or something like that, to give you a general size relation in factoring in distance from the target. At really close distances, it can be argued that general aiming would be enough to get the job done. I'm not going to get into that. We're talking specifically about using the optic body to aim itself. At certain distances, I'm going to be able to index or estimate off of how much target fits in that bracket to give me an idea of what my ideal placement would be. Now, one of the things that's somewhat aggravating about this is as distance increases, you have to fight the perception that the gun is actually pointing higher than it really is, because you're like, oh, I have the bracket and it's high on the head. It just feels like the gun is too high. If you place the gun against the target, you can see how high the optic actually sits against the target itself. It's not considerable. So while distance will magnify the perception that your aim is egregiously off of where you want to hit based on your elevation of your optic window, it's not actually that case, and that's why you have to practice this and you have to practice to shoot it. Inside of 5-7 yards, my sight picture is going to look something like this. It's a very generous bracket. I'm able to put the head right there in the middle, and I can use those tips of the owls to index off the shoulders of the target to give me a general idea of where my rounds are going to be placed. As we move back, the target becomes smaller, obviously. And now I have to start to bracket the entire body inside of those two owl ears. Now, something that comes up, well, I don't use an RMR. And I think if you're familiar with MRDS currently, time this video was made, you may be watching this 20 years in the future, almost every other optic that's out there that'll go on a handgun doesn't have the same design as a Trijicon. They have like a dome, an oval or a circle or that type of shape. It's rounded. What I recommend for people with optics like that is dead center of the optic, I'm going to put a mark right on the top of the dome, of the top of the window. I'm going to use whiteout or a paint pen. I'm going to make it really thin but really obvious. That's going to be my point of aim. That's going to be dead center of the optic window, which gives me dead center of the handgun. And me being as specific as I am, I actually take a caliper and measure it because I want to be as specific as possible. Now, I've seen some people that actually do that mark in relation to how their dot projects in the window. I wouldn't recommend that, because depending on how specific you are when you're painting that, you could be painting it off because that dot floats freely in the window and it's not dead center of the optic, dead center of the handgun, dead center of the bore axis. And this is exactly what we want. Now, have to reiterate, this isn't a precise point of aim. Now, it can be at closer distances, but even then, I'm not going to be willing to say you can be precise with this, depending on how good your eye-hand coordination works in relation with the technique. But even as distance increases, I can use a bracketing technique off of the optic body to deliver accurate gunfire. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. You think about the actual bore axis height, the optic height. I'm using the two owl ears to bracket my target, depending on the distances where I'm going to bracket off the human form. The height over bore, if you will, is not so extreme. Again, we're going for practical accuracy, especially as distance increases. But it's exaggerated in your sight picture versus what's actually occurring with your actual height. Distance factors in, technique factors in. Grip is extremely important with this technique. The question comes up, and I get people ask me this in classes, and this is why I teach it: do I focus on the actual optic body when I'm shooting, like I would your traditional front iron sight, or do I focus on the target? I've had the best success focusing on the target, remaining target focused. My bracket is going to be blurry in my sight picture, if you will, and be able to deliver accurate gunfire, practically speaking. The closer I am, the better I'm going to get hits. Of course, it's easier to get hits closer and just further away. Anyway, some people advocate focusing on the optic itself, especially with the domed optic, to be more precise. I would advocate against that because you're using a 75, 85 MOA front sight at that point. It doesn't give you the same degree of eye-hand coordination, which is what you're largely relying on for this type of shooting anyway. So as you can see, these things that have a possibility of occurring are not the end of the world, but it's something that we need to practice for. If you're going to take it upon yourself because you want to be progressive and you want to be shooting handguns in a way that's physiologically more reliable than iron sights, you want to get away from iron sights because you believe in red dots and you believe that it's a technology that's going to make you more effective as a shooter, then this is something that you just have to accept. You're going to have to practice these kinds of things and be proficient with them in the event that your optic goes down, because anything can fail. Anything. And optics are definitely on there. Now, I'm not a naysayer when it comes to optics. I'm not necessarily worried about EMPs. Sure, they're on my list, but they're way down there just above being attacked by a unicorn. Yeah, both are possible. Both are probable within the universe. To disprove them would be kind of difficult. But I also understand that there's things that are more likely than that. And while I can't hedge my bets, because if I could predict the future, I'd probably be, well, I'd win the lottery every week just for fun. We need to account for these things and we need to practice for them. So you can't be a pedestrian when it comes to these techniques. If you're willing to take the time and spend the money to put a red dot on your handgun, you definitely need to be proficient with it. And being proficient with it also includes addressing the 3 types of failures that you can have with your MRDS. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly. It must work, huh? I didn't hit my camera. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's still taped. It's not like I went back there and cheated or anything. It's not the greatest shooting, but one round outside of the B zone. What's that they say about haters? They're gonna hate.